Hi, welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today is a very exciting day. First of all, I am bringing you my August wrap-up, but the more exciting thing is today I am drawing the winner for the giveaway for Summer Book Bingo. So for the Summer Book Bingo, anytime anyone got a bingo, they could post it on social media and tag me, and that counted as an entry into the giveaway. So there were so many of you who got blackouts this year and your whole board was filled up, and that was 12 entries into the giveaway. But there was quite a few of you who only got like 1 or 2, and so those still count as an entry. So you may still win. As an update to my Summer Book Bingo, unfortunately, I did not black out my board. I was so close. I only had 1 book to complete and then I would have done it. I almost think I would have rather been a couple of books off, because then it wouldn't have felt so painful to be so close and yet not get it. So the only prompt that I didn't fulfill was a kid pick. And my daughter chose the book Legacy, which is book 8 in the Keeper of the Lost City series, and I just didn't get to it. I read a lot of really big books in August, which I'll get to in just a second. So unfortunately, I just ran out of time, and Legacy was a really big book too. So that's unfortunate. I am planning to read that in September though. That is on my September TBR. Works perfect for series September. So it's fine, it all worked out, but unfortunately I did not black out my board, which is kind of sad. So the way that I am going to pick the giveaway for this is I have a random number generator up on my screen here. There were 232 entries into Summer Book Bingo this year, which is just insane. The participation was so much higher than last year, and it was so fun to see all your entries and all the books that you read on Instagram. But I assigned everyone's entries a random number, and so from there I will just do this random number generator, and whichever number pops up is the person who wins, and you will win a $25 gift card to the online book retailer of your choice. So that could be Amazon, or it could be Barnes & Noble, or it could be Book Outlet or Thrift Books, or anything like that, that I can purchase a $25 online gift card for you. So we're gonna go ahead and spin. Well, it's not spinning. I feel like I'm spinning a wheel. It feels like the booktube spin almost. All right, here we go. The number is 73, which would be Hannah from Ball Gowns and Books. So Hannah, congratulations. You have won yourself a $25 gift card to the online book retailer of your choice. So please contact me on social media so that way I can get your information and get that gift card to you. Okay, now I am going to go ahead and jump into my reading wrap up for August. And as I go, I will tell you which space on the bingo board these books fit into, and I'll link my wrap-ups for July and June down below so that way you can see all the books that went into all the spaces. I do have a few things that didn't really fit in spaces that I read, like short stories and random things, so I'll mention those as well, but I'm gonna go in ascending star order. So I'll start with my 1 DNF of the month and then work my way up. I actually have quite a few 5 stars this month, which is always exciting. Okay, so my first is my DNF, like I said, and I'm hesitant to even talk about this being a DNF. Oh, this book is so popular in the homeschooling community, particularly like the Christian homeschool community, and pretty much every homeschool mom I know, I think most of them have read this book, and they've all said it is a must read for homeschool moms, and I didn't finish it. And that's The Mission of Motherhood by Sally Clarkson. I went into this fully anticipating to absolutely love this book, and I got about 50 pages in and just, it was really not working for me. And there's a couple reasons for that. So first of all, her message very much is that women were created to be nurturers, were created to be mothers, and that they can more easily raise and nurture their children when they don't have to juggle working full-time with taking care of their children. And I understand the sentiment with that, and I personally in my life agree with that, because I have chosen to stay home and homeschool my daughter. But I also think that that is not necessarily a thing that is feasible for certain people, and for other people, they just don't feel called to that, and that's okay. I don't think it's impossible to be a good mom and work full time. I think that she was more writing to people who want to stay home but feel like it's not enough to just be a mom. And so I think that that is why she wrote this book, and that makes sense in that context. And I think that it's a book that will really be good for people who want to stay home but are kind of struggling with that aspect of it. I've always been very confident with my decision to stay at home. I've always wanted to stay at home even before I ever had children. It was something my husband and I talked about even before we were married. I said that I wanted to homeschool, and so that was something that we had discussed from the very beginning. So I felt like for that, the message just wasn't there for me. And then in addition, the way that she portrayed staying at home was very, very idyllic. And I had a feeling that if I continued to read this book, that she was going to give practical applications that were going to make me feel bad for not doing enough to make my daughter's childhood perfect and memorable and everything that it should be. And so for that reason, I was like, I don't think I need to read the rest of this book. It just felt like it wasn't for me. It feels like a book that might be really good for some people. And so I understand why it is beloved, but it just was not for me, unfortunately, and I felt really kind of frustrated while I was reading it. Okay, next up is a book that I think I would rate 2 to 3 stars, in that range. That book is Reckless by Cornelia Funk, and this book I used for my book that I have owned for more than a year. Was going to use The Mission of Motherhood for that one, but then I ended up DNFing it, so I didn't use it for that. So Reckless. I love Cornelia Funke, like, so much. I love Inkheart. I think it is one of the best middle grade fantasy series that there is, and I think that it is a travesty that Inkheart did not make it up to the level of hype that Harry Potter did. And I think the reason is because it was a translated work, and so it just wasn't as publicized as I think that it should have been, but I think Inkheart is like the best. So this, I think, is more classified as a YA, but I would say it could still work for like the younger end of YA, upper end of middle grade content wise. This is about it's called the Mirror World series. Like, this is the first in a trilogy, and you can travel through this mirror into this world that is very fairy tale-esque. There are elements of it that are extremely unique to this book, but there's a lot of classic fairy tale references as well that get put in there. And so that element of it, I just absolutely loved. I loved the premise. I loved all these fairy tale elements, but unfortunately I felt like the characters were super blah. Like, I just did not care about a single person in this book. And I also felt like the plot was really just, it felt secondary to cramming in as many fairy tale references as you possibly could. And that's saying a lot because I love fairy tale retelling. So I just feel like this book had potential and it just wasn't there, and it makes me really sad because I really, really wanted to love it. I should also mention that this book was on my Read a Rid project because I've owned this book for probably like 4 years at least, and have tried to start it twice and never got far. So I actually finally finished it. So I could check that off that list as well. Next up that I completed was an audiobook, which is 5 Little Pigs by Agatha Christie. I mentioned this in my vacation reading vlog as it was the only book that I finished while I was on vacation. So I'm not really going to talk about it too much here. It is a Poirot mystery where he is solving things that happened, I think, like 15 to 20 years prior to the book. So he's going back, interviewing people and all of that kind of stuff. So it's kind of an interesting setting, but I found all the characters supremely unlikable. Like, I hated every single person. I felt like they were all just really self-centered and super annoying and immoral. And I was just like, I don't care about any of you. And so like that really, I didn't enjoy hearing their perspectives because they were so like nasty and self-centered that it just like, you're basically reading the narratives that they are giving to Poirot. And so I just didn't enjoy that. The ending did take me by surprise. I thought I knew and I didn't. So that is what made it a 3-star, but I unfortunately did not love it. I had 2 4-star books for the month of August, which is pretty good. So the first one is Emma by Jane Austen. This was a reread for me. I think this is the third time that I've read this book. I read it once in high school, and then I read it in my early 20s as well. And so it had been a long time. It'd been about like 10 years, I think, since I'd read it. So it was fun to reread it. I actually listened to most of this on audio while I was walking my dog, and it was a really fun book on audio because you get a lot more of the wit and sarcasm, I think, depending on who your narrator is. But I loved the narrator that read this book, and it just enhanced the experience for sure. I still can't say that this is one of my favorite Jane Austen novels. In fact, I would actually say it's one of my least favorites, but still my least favorite Jane Austen is still 4 stars. So that tells you something right there, that my lowest Jane Austen books are still heads and shoulders over so many other books. The wit in this book and the humor was like top notch and was what really made it for me, because the reason it's not a favorite Austen for me is I absolutely cannot relate to Emma at all. I can't relate to how she thinks or how she behaves at all. As time goes on, I'm realizing that a lot of people's favorite Jane Austens, the protagonist is someone that they can relate to, that is similar in personality, because every single one of Jane Austen's heroines are flawed in some way. It's almost like, which flaw can you relate to the most? And I just can't relate to Emma. So that's the reason why it's not 5 stars. But oh my gosh, still such a fun book. So glad that I read it. And I read it with a wonderful group of ladies. I read it with Christy and Kate and Evie and Stephanie, which are the same ladies who we have co-hosted read-alongs of Dr. Zhivago and A Bad Business. And now it looks like we're doing North and South for Victober. So that's super fun. The next 4-star read was also a buddy read, and that's The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver. This was also on my reader read list, and I had very, very low expectations going into this book. So it ended up being just a lot better than I anticipated. This book is about a missionary and his family who traveled to the Congo right around the time that the Congolese received their independence from Belgium. This book is told from the perspective of the minister's wife and each of his 4 daughters. And the thing that impressed me the most about this book is that every single narrative is in the first person, and they are all incredibly distinct and unique. And you could not read the title headings at all and still know who is speaking. And I have read only one other book that is like that, and it's Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, and that had even more narratives than this one did, but all of those were super unique too. And it's hard for me to find a multi-POV book in the first person where everyone sounds super different, and this is one where they really did. All the girls' personalities really came through. They all had very different personalities. I was also surprised at how much humor there was in this. Like, there was a lot as they're adjusting to life in the Congo and kind of dealing with things. And there's a lot of elements that are going on. Like, the father is incredibly religious, but is just very vindictive and nasty and judgmental about it, even with the Congolese people and especially with his own family. So there's definitely some spiritual and emotional abuse that is happening in their home that can be very difficult to read, and as a result, the girls' view of God and Bible stories are very skewed, which at times can be very amusing how they kind of misinterpret certain famous Bible stories. I will say that I think that this is a book that you would get more out of if you have a religious background. And that doesn't mean that if you don't have a religious background, you shouldn't read this book and you won't get anything out of it, because I don't think that that's true. But there's a lot of references that I think you would not get if you're not as familiar with Bible stories and certain religious practices. And there's just a lot of references that made it really that much more interesting and fun for me to read. It's a very dark story though. There's a lot of heartache, and you know from the beginning that this book is not going to have a happy ending, because from the very beginning, the very first chapter, which is from the mother's perspective, you know she says that one of her children is not going to make it out of the Congo alive. And so you're already preparing yourself and you're wondering which of the 4 it's going to be. And It's heartbreaking at times. When I started this book, I was like, oh my goodness, is this a new 5-star read? Because it was so vividly written. I felt like I knew each of the girls. I felt like I knew their village in the Congo. I felt like the Congo itself was almost like an additional character in this book because it was written so vividly and you really felt like you were there. You could see it all. You could smell it, taste it. Like, it was just so well written, and I loved that about it. Unfortunately, after a very big incident happens in the book, the characters are changed from then on, which makes sense in context, but it made it much harder for me to connect with them, and as a result, it made the ending of the book really drag for me. I felt like it became very preachy, and there was just a lot about guilt in there. Like, I feel like every single character has survivor's guilt, some of them to a very high extreme, to where it completely changes their personalities, or they invest their time in very political things. And so the ending of the book felt very politically driven, felt very, I don't know, it was very different from the whole first like 2/3 to 3/4 of the book. And it's really unfortunate because I loved the rest of it so much. So that really brought it down for me. And the guilt just felt heavy and felt like a lot to slog through. It felt very repetitive and almost frustrating. But the last page of the book actually lifted the ending just a little bit for me in terms of absolving guilt and moving on and forgiving yourself for things that you wish you had done differently or know you should have done differently. And so I do think that that helped. Otherwise, maybe it would have been a little lower than a 3-star rating for me. But I think that this is a book that I would actually really want to read again. So I definitely would give it 4 stars. I buddy read this with Shelley Swearingen and Gloria Z. Thompson, and it was really fun to hear their thoughts on this book too, and I think we all enjoyed it, maybe more than we were expecting. I'm not really sure. Actually, Shelley said she had only ever heard good things about this, but I'd actually heard some really negative things about it. So I heard the opposite from people who did not enjoy this book. So I was expecting not to like it. So as a result, I liked it a lot more than I was anticipating. Okay, let's move into 5-star books. I actually have 2 short stories that I'm going to talk about first. And I didn't read short story collections. These are individual short stories. So I'm going to talk about both of them. So the first one that I read was The Devil and Tom Walker by Washington Irving. It was the only thing that I read for Faustathon. I kind of wanted to actually read like Goethe's Faust and maybe Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus story, but fortunately I did not have time for those. But I did read The Devil and Tom Walker, which is a short story, and oh my word, I loved it so much. I loved every second of it. I love Washington Irving. I discovered that a couple years ago when I read Sleepy Hollow. His writing is just, the imagery is so lush and vivid, and the way that he writes characters is so humorous and great. Like, I just love the humor in his stories as well as the depth of exploration of topics that he brings in. So if you know anything about Faust, you know it's a man who basically makes a deal with the devil, and that's what happens with Tom Walker. He and his wife end up meeting with the devil in the woods, and they end up trying to make a deal with him, and as is always the case in Faustian type deals, it doesn't end up going well. It was interesting to watch the progression of Tom Walker and just all of it. I don't want to say any more than that because it is such a short story. So I don't want to spoil anything, but I laughed aloud quite a few times at descriptions or things that the characters said and did. And in the same respect, it caused me to really reflect. And I thought it was really interesting how the devil compared certain people that white people in that society would have seen as bad, and then was like, well, yeah, but you know, here's what you're doing, and it's really not any different. I'm actually pleased with what all of you are doing. And I was just like, oh, it felt like kind of a revolutionary thought too for the time period that it was written in. I can't remember exactly what time period, but I think it was just a little bit past like Revolutionary War colonial time. So some of the things that he was saying and the comparisons that he was making felt like not the normal thought of the day, which I thought was interesting. The second short story that I read was The Sound of Thunder by Ray Bradbury, and this was for the sci-fi space on my board. I should also say Poisonwood Bible was for set in a country that was different from my own, and Emma was for the classic space. So I'm already forgetting to update my bingo board, and Tom Walker didn't make it onto the board at all. So anyways, Sound of Thunder was for my sci-fi space. It's a short story by Ray Bradbury. If I can find the link for it, I'll put it down below, because it was actually a PDF that I read online, which was really nice. It was from an article that Christy sent me about like the top 10 sci-fi short stories that everyone should read, and it was on there, and I thought it sounded really interesting. So I decided to read it so that way I could fill my sci-fi space. I had no expectations going in because, like I said, I hadn't read Bradbury, so I didn't know what his writing style was going to be like or anything like that. But it's very interesting because it kind of reminds me of Jurassic Park, because there are dinosaurs. Basically, these people can go back into the past. They have a time machine, so people, like wealthy people, can go back and hunt dinosaurs. And it's very interesting the way that it dives into kind of like butterfly effect kind of a thing, how small changes in the past greatly affect the future and all that kind of stuff. But it was a really interesting idea explored, and I really enjoyed it, and it makes me want to read more Bradbury, which is great because I just picked up a bunch of books by him from my library for 10 cents a piece. Another 5-star book, not short story, that I read was The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. I'm not going to talk about this like really at all because I just posted a vlog where I gave like in-depth thoughts, although it was more of a spoilery vlog. So I guess this will be more for if you have not read The Way of Kings, but I feel like a lot of people have. I feel like I am like way behind on the Stormlight train. I loved this book. It feels very foundational to the world that Brandon Sanderson is creating here. So I will say that it is not really a fast-paced read because you feel really lost through a lot of the story as he's introducing different people groups, different nations, different creatures that exist, and just a lot of it was very almost disorienting at first because you don't know anything and you're just kind of dropped in and you're like, okay. But it's great. Sanderson does a really good job of acclimating you, of explaining things. There's a wide cast of characters and there's a lot that's happening, and there are multiple different types of magic. So there's a lot. It's a lot, honestly, especially for someone like me who doesn't read a ton of high fantasy, but it was still accessible and I understood it. And I just love Sanderson's character work and I love his world building. So it's great. And I've heard a lot of people tell me that Words of Radiance, which is book 2, is actually their favorite in the series. So that makes me super excited to start that one. Also, Way of Kings was for favorite author space because I love Sanderson. Though this is my first foray into Stormlight, I have read Mistborn and the Skyward series and really enjoyed both of them. The last book that I'm going to talk about is Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. This was for my 500 pages or more space, and it's well over 500 pages. I started this book actually in June, so I didn't have like a ton to read in August. I think I had like a few hundred pages left. This book is over 1,200 pages. So it's a lot. There's a lot here. This was part of a readathon that was hosted by Christy Lewis from Dostoevsky in Space, Naomi's Bookshelf, Janelle from Too Fond of Books, and Victoria from A Musical Bookworm. And I did not attend hardly any of the lives, just the first one. And then after that, I was so behind that I didn't want to go in and like be spoiled. Although I had read this before, but I'd read an abridged copy multiple times without realizing that it was abridged. So this is like almost twice as long as the abridged copy that I owned. That one I think was like 700 or 800 pages. And like I said, this is a little over 1,200. So there was a lot more in here. In fact, there were whole story arcs that I didn't remember at all, some of which weren't super important and it was okay that they were cut out, and some of which were super important. I really enjoyed this book. I always said for a really long time that this was my favorite book of all time in high school, which is when I read it. And then all through my 20s, I was like, this is my favorite book of all time. And then once I got to around 30, I was like, you know, I haven't read this book in like 10 years. So maybe it's not my favorite anymore. And I reread it and I still gave it 5 stars, but I would not say it's like a favorite book of all time, but it is one that I think that I would still want to reread again, and I really, really enjoyed. If you're not familiar with the story, which I feel like most people are, it's about Edmond Dantes, who is a young man with a very bright future, and there are some people who don't like him and or are jealous of him. And so they decide that they are basically going to frame him for something, and he gets imprisoned. And while he's in prison, he just starts plotting revenge for when he's able to get out. He escapes, and then the rest of the book is very much just him enacting that revenge on people, and it's a lot. There's a lot of side characters and a lot of backstory that you get, and I think there are quite a few people that I talked to during this read along who really got bogged down in the middle because there's so many details, which is totally valid. I totally understand that. But I really loved it because I felt like it culminated really, really well. And all these little details that you're like, why is this here? Like, there was a reason for all of it. And the way that he slowly calculated his revenge is just incredible, to be quite honest. This is very much a plot-driven book and not a character-driven book. And so I think that that's why I can't say that this is a favorite of all time anymore, because I felt like it was a really fun ride and I really enjoyed all the details. But it's not a book that I'm just going to sit there and think about over and over and over again like I do with like Crime and Punishment. That's a book that has stuck with me because of its exploration of human nature and deep characterization. And so I feel like those kind of books resonate with me more. And I feel like I used to be much more of a plot-driven reader. And so it makes sense that this would have been my favorite book of all time, easily, hands down, when I was in high school and early adulthood, because this would have totally been my jam. And I still loved it. Like I said, it's 5 stars, but it still is not quite at the hype that it was for me when I was younger, if that makes sense. Well, that's it. Those are the books that I read to try to finish up summer book bingo. And I feel like it was a really good reading month overall. I had a couple of duds, but overall I really enjoyed everything that I read this month. I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. Have you read any of these books? If so, what were your thoughts? What was your favorite book that you read in August? I hope you had a wonderful reading month in August, and I hope that that continues into September. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.